Hello, everyone. Welcome to our Race and Place panel discussion. This panel discussion features community engaged professionals from a variety of organizations who are uncovering the legacies of these discriminatory practices and seeking a more socially just future for the people and places that have been harmed. My name is Jerica Logan, and I am the Outreach Coordinator for the Center for Urban and Regional Analysis, otherwise known as CURA. I will be your host for this event. If you require closed captioning, you will find a box at the bottom of the screen called CC. Please box and select Show Subtitles. This will allow the subtitles during the presentation. Please feel free to submit any questions at any time in the webinar Q&A box. We will ask as many of the questions at the last portion of the presentation. And if we do not get to your question, we do apologize. If you have any additional questions following this event, please feel free to email me at logan.433@osu.edu. This event is approved for one AICP CM credit. To claim your CM credits, log into your My APA account on the APA website and enter in the event log. There will also be a brief survey at the end of the webinar. If you have time, please provide your feedback. To learn more about CURA's, this and CURA's other future events, please sign up for our monthly newsletter and visit cura.osu.edu. You can also like CURA on Facebook and follow us on Twitter and Instagram. And now I'm going to pass it over to Josh Sudvari, our geospatial librarian, to introduce himself.
Hi, everyone. My name is Josh Sidvari. I'm the Geospatial Information Librarian at Ohio State. The Research Commons at the Ohio State University Libraries has been a co-sponsor for the Race and Place Summer Series, and I'm very excited today to be able to introduce our panelists for our final event in the series. Start with Braden Crooks is a founding partner at Designing the We, a social impact design studio operating in community-driven social and economic development. The Designing the We team designs programs, policies, and enterprises that grow local communities and global networks dealing with deep crises, from the history of redlining to the future of work. He is on the board of the New York State Sustainable Business Council and has served as the president of the board of Sure We Can, a nonprofit collective for canners, who are those who make their living by redeeming cans and bottles for 5 cents. Welcome, Braden. April Simone has over 15 years of experience in strategically designing, developing, and launching for-profit, nonprofit, and government projects. Continuing to advocate for social innovation, Ms. Simone is co-creator of various for-purpose ventures and initiatives that promote market-based solutions to address complex social challenges. A Dean Merit Scholar, she recently completed her Master of Science in Design and Urban Ecologies from Parsons, the New School for Design. Ms. Simone continues to be recognized for her leadership and dedication in supporting frameworks that promote a just and equitable society. Thanks for being here today, April. Cate Mingoya-LaFortune is the Chief Officer of Climate Resilience and Land Use for Groundwork USA. In this role, she leads Groundwork USA's climate resilience initiatives and provides technical assistance and support to nationwide brownfield remediation projects. Originally from Queens, New York, Cate began her career teaching middle school science to students in the Bronx and Brownsville, Brooklyn. She transitioned to the policy side of working with low-income communities as the Director of Policy and Program Development for the Massachusetts Division of Public Housing. Great to have you today, Cate. And lastly, J.T. Tabron is an assistant register in the Durham County, North Carolina Register of Deeds office, where he manages the real estate division. He's also heavily employed by a wife and 4-year-old son. Outside of land management, JT pursues interests in community engagement and equity as a member of organizations including ICMA, the International City County Management Association, GARE, Government Alliance on Race and Equity, and the NFBPA, National Forum of Black Public Administrators. For the past 3 years, he has co-chaired a public-private work group which seeks to uncover racially restrictive covenants within the public record, then share the history of this information to help citizens empower themselves. Thanks for being here today, JT. It's great to have all of you with us. I'm really looking forward to today's discussion. We're going to start off, I'm going to start off by giving each of you in turn 3 to 5 minutes to share your perspective on today's topic. And I'll start with Braden. Braden, could you discuss how your work with Undesign the Red Line has impacted the way that you look at place, and also how the project in Columbus came to fruition with the YWCA?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much for having me, and being part of this conversation is really wonderful. The Undesign the Red Line exhibit starts with redlining. I mean, I imagine a lot of the folks on the call are familiar with redlining, but for those who aren't, redlining really sets the stage as terms of a policy for the way that cities are going to look, and how we're going to live, really, for many, many decades. And the exhibit begins with the kind of infamous homeowners loan corporation maps of the 1930s, which are probably the most visible example of redlining, but certainly not the only one. The FHA, Federal Housing Administration, is involved in redlining, banks, even local municipalities, others. So, these maps basically lay out, where access to credit is going to flow very easily, home loans, things like that, and then where what they call hazardous areas, which they color in red. And when you look at the area descriptions, which tell you why, it will say things like, quote, hazardous infiltration, Negro infiltration, right? And it will name many different, particularly targets Black folks, and many other racial groups as hazardous. And this is coming from the federal government, and it's in the FHA, Federal Housing Administration underwriting manual. It's in all these different documents in terms of how we're going to really insure and underwrite homes. And that, I think, when you look at place, that is putting, essentially the haves and have-nots right on a map and saying, this area and this area is going to be determined for investment or not, really depending on who lives there. And there are other factors, but who lives there becomes really the salient one. And that sort of starts, and it's not the only thing that happens, right? So you have a cascade of things that happen across America. You have urban renewal and slum clearance, right? We're going to be bulldozing neighborhoods. We say things like slums are a cancer on the city, right? So we remove a tumor, and of course highways are going to blast through neighborhoods, certainly in Columbus, but all over the country, which is going to cause whole new waves of disinvestment. So it's almost a whole other wave of redlining and disinvestment in some sense, and deindustrialization, job loss, the waves of unemployment, planned shrinkage, right? Cities are going to start disinvesting public services from certain neighborhoods. And so these waves of policies happen over a period of time that really send redline neighborhoods, which, mind you, when they were redlined in the 1930s, are not, blighted, empty, abandoned spaces. These are really full neighborhoods, beautiful neighborhoods with mom and pop businesses and strong sense of community, but that nonetheless get sent on a pathway of decline and really lead into the hallmarks of a redline neighborhood, abandoned homes, fires, shuttered businesses, unemployment. So that trajectory really splits two Americas. While we're doing that to one group of people, mostly people of color, in urban areas, we're building out white American suburbia with these home loans, which is coming in the same policy. And that's going to really create a geography of almost apartheid in America, where you could have different systems for different people and really just base that on zip code. And by this point, you don't really necessarily need to talk about race, but you can have different schools, right? You can have different policing, you can have different housing, have all these different systems. And that's really based on geography. So in many ways, place becomes the number one way in which we're preserving racial inequality and home ownership and wealth and how that all gets connected. And, one thing I'll just say before, to anchor this is that, we understand this history so that we can explain the present, so that we can explain and understand why we're here now, right? The history is an explanation of the present. And then you look to point out, right, there are people who say, they don't want to talk about this history. Well, that's largely because they want a different explanation for where we are now, right? Which is not that we created this system, which is not that we can show you the policies, we have all the evidence, but to essentially say, hey, you know, some people just didn't work hard enough, or, you know, maybe they didn't want it, or, you know, essentially to say, we're going to blame the folks who are the victims of redlining for the consequences of redlining. And that explanation means we don't have to do anything. And in fact, maybe if we do something, it's oftentimes it's even punitive in the sense of, you know, blaming the victims of redlining. And so we have to actually tell this story because we haven't healed, we haven't repaired, we haven't undone redlining. We still live in the world that it created, even though we've said, okay, yeah, we've made this type of policy illegal. By the way, it still goes on. But we haven't really undone that history. We still live in the world it created. And for that reason, we're stuck. We're really stuck. And we're stuck in this really tumultuous moment when, you know, people are trying to bury this history, when people are trying to say it didn't happen and we can just ignore it. And we badly need to heal from it. So, you know, one thing just to say about, you know, all that policy, that's that policy of place and how place and geography played a role in our lives has to become a much more salient thing that we talk about in our cities, but also in our culture and education in general.
Thank you, Braden.
Yeah, thank you.
April, I'm going to present the same question to you. Can you talk a little bit about how your work on Design the Red Line has impacted the way you look at place and maybe the impacts you've seen in the cities that you've had the exhibition?
Thank you, Josh. Thank you, everyone, for creating such an important space to have this dialogue. For me, the Undesign the Red Line exhibition really has been an impetus to capture a lived experience. Very young, growing up in the Bronx, where 90% of my neighborhood, the East Tremont neighborhood of the Bronx, was literally in rubble, really wanted to tell this story of how this happened. And in understanding, sort of seeing your mom get up every day and go to work and sort of make these sacrifices, but yet coming back home where, you know, redlining isn't just a concept or a phenomenon that starts under New Deal policies. It's a psychology that has been here since the first boats landed. So it's really, the work has really shifted to understand how perceptions and mental models, which is at the crux when you start looking at these histories, that someone sat at a table and made a determination of who had value and who didn't. And I think, again, it's people who are put in positions of authority to steward the ideologies and principles of democracy. You know, as I've mentioned before, you know, shifting away from designing the way and undesign the red line, a lot of my work now at the practice of democracy is how do we spatialize life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness that begins to respond back to these gouges that have happened again since the First Nations genocide in this country. And we need to begin to create the pedagogy that's necessary to understand and heal it. When we look at a map doesn't tell the nuances of these neighborhoods and these blocks. So it becomes important to set a context that, again, as Braden mentioned, these are vibrant corridors. But not only are they vibrant corridors, the transition of these corridors as we are massively creating the suburbs of America, where people like my mother could not access and become part of this concept of intergenerational wealth, these were areas that really fit that Americana opportunity, that they would have walkability, that we would have access to, you know, the different neighborhood assets, movie theaters, et cetera. And what you see over time, for example, where I grew up, what was once a movie theater transitions to a garbage refuse site that then transitions to a dialysis center. So working at this intersection of architecture, planning, and systems thinking really begins to tell the story of space. How did it go from a movie theater to now a dialysis center that reflects the disparate impacts to the social determinants of health that, again, are yielded from this concept of race? And race isn't the only thing. There's a lot of isms that, again, reinforce this hierarchy of human value within the built environment. So again, pedagogy is a necessary component, and exhibitions like the Undesign the Red Line do that work. And then there's the next phase of it. Well, how do we transition this into actually the spatialization of equity, healing, and justice? And that's where we look at how do we inform wellness campuses? within our neighborhoods. But it first has to start with the shift that these neighborhoods are even worthy of that type of a design and planning process. Because unfortunately, when we look today, what has been replaced in these spaces is buildings that won't last for 10 years or still tell a story of how we place value to the people within these communities. And I think we're in a very pivotal moment because our democracy, whether we look at it like this or not, but the way we have spatialized the geographical footprint of America, again, far before redlining maps, has really informed the divisions of today. And we need a concerted effort of practitioners that are really willing to take this on and look at it from a transdisciplinary approach and be educated so that when we plan and design, we actually tell a story of equity through our buildings and through our sidewalks. Thank you.
Thank you. Cate, I'm going to turn to you now and ask if you can tell us a little bit about your work with Groundwork USA and what you're doing to help residents in the various cities you're involved with. And if you can tell us a little bit about how you see the relationship between historical patterns of segregation and climate change vulnerabilities.
Yeah, absolutely. So I work with Groundwork USA, which is the national support organization for 21 people-centered environmental justice organizations across the country. We're usually in the second or third largest city in a given state, places that have history of industry or boom bust cycles. So we're in Cincinnati, San Diego, Yonkers, New York. You can hop on our website, groundworkusa.org, to see if there's a trust near you. But the value of the work that we do is by putting residents in the driver's seat in making decisions about changes to their built environment. We believe that residents have the deepest and most nuanced understanding of what needs to change to keep them safer from the climate crisis, to get them access to the healthy food resources that they need, to have clean, safe spaces for their children to play. So that's a lot of the work that we do. And one of the programs that I lead is our Climate Safe Neighborhoods Partnership, which is a 16-city partnership with many of our trusts to look at the relationship between historical race-based housing segregation. We can often use redlining as a proxy for that, but you can also use urban renewal, highway placement. There's a lot of ways to dig into and understand the way that land use and land use policies are actually a vessel for values or for aspirational values. So those are some of the ones that we use, and the climate crisis. And there's some work that's been done, some community science work and some work using national land cover data sets that show that places that were historically redlined are significantly hotter, significantly wetter, have fewer green spaces, have more asphalt, and are still majority minority. So as James Baldwin used to like to say, the past has not yet passed. And I think we see that really true when we look at geospatial images of places that have histories of that work. And so what our Climate Safe Neighborhoods Partnership does is it's sort of a 5-year process to work with communities and community members, intergenerational coalitions, everyone from the boys basketball team to Mary, who's owned her apartment for 60 years, who lives on the corner, to look at the relationship between segregation and the way that we're experiencing extreme heat, fire risk, poor air quality, and flooding. And to do a couple of things with that, we spend the first year pulling together a coalition of residents. We do door knocking, we post up at community events, we show up to the Tenants Association meeting and chat with residents about why do our communities look the way that they do? Because our communities don't look the way they do by accident, and they're not going to change by accident. And Braden, you sort of alluded to this, that sometimes people can think like, oh, well, things just sort of came about. Of course, people would live near other people who have shared a similar culture. And there's not that understanding that there's a history that forced lower income folks into low-lying areas that are more likely to flood or in proximity to industry. There's a real intentionality behind this. And honestly, a lot of residents know that, even if they can't name the policy, but it's really cool to show up with the receipts and be like, friends, it is written so clearly. They said the quiet part out loud here. So we spend the first year understanding why our communities look the way they do. We spend another year working with residents to understand their priorities and to prioritize the changes they would like to see in their built environment. And then we spend a couple of years doing community organizing around systems change. Because as I mentioned, we know our communities don't look the way that they do by accident. We need to put in that work to change the policies, change the systems, change the decisions, change who gets to be at the table to make decisions about an equitable distribution of resources. We're really interested in not just fixing that harm that has happened, but keeping that harm from happening again by changing the way decisions are made at usually the municipal level. At the same time, folks need help now. If you're in Richmond, Virginia, and you're waiting for a bus out in the August heat, it's hot now and you need a shade structure. So we do a lot of work through our ground core and our green team and with residents who volunteer and do things like increase tree canopy cover, put in demonstration project shade structures, put in rain barrels to reduce flooding. And do that sort of now work to show people change is possible, and is a really important component of that bigger picture, that two-pronged strategy of solutions for now and then longer term systems change. So that's a little bit about some of that work. And just to sum it up, we've seen, I can talk more about this later, but I've seen some really great success in changing master planning processes or the way that funds are distributed through the municipal budget, or who has access to sitting on resource distribution councils when there's state tax funding that's available. So lots of really cool things we can dig into to how a map can really open up and serve as a platform for conversations about equity.
Thank you, Cate. JT, can you tell us a little bit about your work with the Hacking into History project and how it's made you think differently about your role as Assistant Register for Deeds for Durham County?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Josh, and thanks everyone for allowing me into this space. So our Hacking into History project is a collaborative, community-driven effort focused on analyzing racially restrictive covenants in Durham, North Carolina. We were organized and received our first grant in 2020. And the project team has a pretty cool collaboration going on, I think. We're comprised of individuals from a local nonprofit called DataWork NC, whose mission is to democratize data. There's also Research Action Design, which is a social justice design company. We've got the School of Library and Information Sciences at North Carolina Central University, which is an HBCU. We have a young lady named Tia Hall, who is our main public session facilitator, and attorney Andrew Wagner, who helps us wade through the historic legal components of racially restrictive covenants. And the Durham County Register of Deeds office is represented by myself. The project's central goal is to share the history and impact of racially restrictive covenants found in Durham's property records. And we do that in large part by retrieving, analyzing, and then transcribing these records that have been pulled from the deeds office. What we do is, I think, really based on the belief that the practice of interrogating these racially restrictive documents as a community can help inform our efforts to dismantle racism across Durham. Now, the how part of this project is that we hold public workshops semi-monthly where we facilitate community discussions among Durham residents by presenting this information in a few different ways. Tia, our lead facilitator, does an unbelievable job of really opening up our sessions and helping people get emotionally grounded and prepared to deal with the complex and challenging sort of feelings that this content can evoke, which I think is really, really important, and I think a cool wrinkle to our project. I then speak a little bit about the financial and social legacy of these documents. Then Attorney Wagner speaks about the legal history, the court cases that have sort of marked the use of these tools of inequity over the years. The next part of the session, which is probably the most powerful piece, is that we let participants look through and then transcribe actual source documents that literally have language like, these premises may not be occupied by anyone with Negro blood unless they're a domestic servant, right? And that really seems to be one of the things that hits people in a big way. From there, we open a forum for sharing around personal feelings, life experiences, and reactions to what people have just discovered. And this is great because a lot of our sessions are multi-ethnic. So we've got a range of demographics there, and just the opportunity for people to sort of get a sense of how other people are digesting this information has been pretty cool, I think. What we're currently doing behind the scenes as a project team now that we've identified all the racially restrictive covenants in Durham from around 1900 through 1978. And we actually have found a few filed after the mid the late 70s. But we're starting to map them around the city with the goal of looking at their relationship to things like historic municipal expenditure and modern trends around gentrification that's really ramping up around here. As for how this project has made me think differently about my role as an assistant register of deeds for Durham County, I think one of the big ones is that I now have sort of a deeper appreciation for the degrees of awareness someone can have about a subject and how that can impact the way one chooses to engage the space around that subject. And what I mean is that I think that many of us, briefly learn about some of this history in school, or maybe by watching a special on TV or something like that. And I include myself in that group. Before getting involved with this project, I knew these records were in my office, literally 100 feet from where I sit. But when you don't take the time to actually really interrogate these artifacts and really test your own understanding of history and how you fit into a society that was built with these documents as part of its framework, then these covenants can sort of just exist as relics, I think, in the back of your mind. And the attorney on our project, Attorney Wagner, has a great term for these covenants. He calls them hidden monuments to racism. And that's exactly what they are until they're actively confronted, which is what I think this project has really helped me do. And then all that said, Braden touched on this a bit earlier when he was speaking, but I've also been thinking more about government's responsibility to not only address sort of current issues, the things we're dealing with now, but also how to look back at previous harms and work with communities to rectify those issues. So that's a little bit about sort of where we are in our project, but I appreciate the question.
Thank you all so much for sharing a little bit about the work that you're doing. I'm really excited to hear more. So to that end, I'm going to turn it over to Jerica to ask a few other questions that we have for you.
So I'm just going to go down the list that I have, and I really want to know a little bit more about the work that April is doing surrounding architecture in urban spaces. So April, are you able to talk about a little bit on what your projects you're working on in the urban planning and architecture space that that really brings some of this home?
Yeah, I think one that's really interesting is the historic St. Roch community in New Orleans. And the client was a second generation, but came about to open several funeral homes in his community, and had sort of this moment where I'm doing this work, being able to create what I create, but it's at the cost of the violence in my community. And he bought an entire city block in New Orleans and said, how do I showcase sort of these histories? This is the property that sits 10 miles northwest of the lower 9th Ward. So we began this project with the client to really look at what happened to this historic transformation of this space, beginning with again, the indigenous populations. We often, Cate brought it up around the heat island effect, for example. Well, this area was covered in cypress. Who would have thought that in such proximity to New Orleans, the city itself, there were actual plantations? I never knew that in uncovering this history. So it was looking at things like the cypress groves that were initially the nature's front line to the flooding that now pervades this area, how all of that was part of an extractive economy that then was used to build New Orleans. So in working with the client, the concept, as I mentioned before, part of healing is understanding that if nowhere in this space something looks as if human value matters, then the ability to situate that first and foremost becomes imperative to shift how we think about space. So essentially with this project, in doing this whole trajectory, it was a redlined community. It had things before redlining as restrictive covenants, which is all important to give, again, this curated conversation, but it's now what do we do about it? So here it was really designing, anchoring structures and corners where there were no walkways. Essentially, sidewalks had been uprooted. They created a highway with an overpass. And it was infusing sort of this hybrid of business uses in these spaces along with community uses. What is really unique about this project is the future infill site will be one of the first burial museums in the country that really talks about Black burial, particularly in New Orleans with the second line, but how death in these areas are another form of, again, the storytelling of place, of what has happened over time, particularly with a garbage a collection site that is still burning underground not too far from here. So with the spaces and the architecture, it really was embodying healing, how we use the spaces to create biophilic rooftops, in a spine through the actual lot that he had purchased, because he could have just fenced it off, put his businesses there, went home and came back. But he said, what is my agency, as we know that public space and its impact with how we think about race, who has access to green spaces. He created, or this desire to allow for the creation of public uses with amphitheaters, again, working with community members doing yoga to heal conditions of violence that, again, are predicated from these deeper histories of policies, practices, and investments. The type of greenery that's used begins to tell a story, particularly around the enslaved markings of sites. We don't know on this particular area, but we know that there's projects that are being done by organizations like Forensic Architecture that have used Sanborn maps, which are historical maps that show imprints of what was in a community, and showed sort of the types of trees that were used to mark enslaved burials. So we're bringing all of that piece of culture. Many of the buildings have this front porch concept so that people can actually sit within the community, have places for shading, again, back to this heat island effect. And I think it's this, the aesthetic and materiality using rammed earth, for example, to create the walls of these structures, water spaces that sort of absorb the flooding and are used as tranquility gardens and reflection areas. And I would have shown a picture, but I think it's the proper use when you're sitting at the table, that when we speak about redlining or we speak about all of these histories, that again, there's a collateral consequence that continues to play out in our built environment. And that one of the mediums is, how do we let, again, the buildings tell a different story? How do we allow these areas to heal? So now this is a community engaged space where there's very little green area for many, 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 many blocks in this space. And it's anchoring this concept with the understanding as well, not about commodification and future speculation and displacement, that again are all still factors of redlining. Because again, back to this misnomer, not only were these places intact within certain points in histories, but even places today that have suffered from the decades of disinvestment, when the community themselves want to invest back into these areas, our financial system is not equipped to respond back, because we still have this home to mortgage value and that we can't even fix. So you literally have infrastructure inequity happening throughout the country in the homes that people live in. So with this project, understanding that while we're not only doing the design, we're working within the financial space to develop an equity fund that really allows for place to be reformed, not from having other people come in, but from people who live there. So it's a pay it forward community wealth building versus this individual wealth building. And then in addition, we're also working with locals to create a land trust in this area. My point is, to architecture, there's a plurality. It isn't just about designing a blueprint and confining yourself to a lot. It's really looking at the ecosystem that architecture operates in. So we could have just designed a building and walked away. But what we're doing is working with someone who wants to put rooted value back into a community that has been uprooted, using Dr. Mindy Fullalove's root shop analogy, and to really begin to understand that it's going to take multiple pieces and multiple stakeholders from the community. So it's an exciting time to, again, push back on, we land a spaceship in a place through architecture, uproot it, and then move somewhere else to the next project. It's really looking at at architecture as a medium to begin to then do the work of healing, to then do the work of equity, and then to do the work of justice, not just to reinforce the human hierarchy, but again, that we all begin to enjoy it and begin to deconstruct these social constructs of race that, again, are deeply embedded in our psychology.
Thank you so much. And then I want to get back to Cate and looking at what updates you have from your organization and about the current work you're doing with residents, and then also if you can touch a little bit about what your organization has done in Cincinnati, since that's a little closer to where we are.
Yeah, absolutely. I can start with Cincinnati. As I'd mentioned, the work that we do under our Climate Safe Neighborhoods Partnership, which is a pretty big piece of the work the trusts do overall, but is not exclusive, is to address this two-pronged strategy of solutions for now. One solution that I'm really excited that we just completed at the Euler High School in the Lower Price Hill neighborhood of Cincinnati is the installation of a green roof that's going to help make that area more climate resilient. It's going to reduce utility costs. Also, we've done pretty tremendous tree planting projects there, planting hundreds of trees with volunteers that have come and creating maintenance plans to make sure that these trees survive in areas that disproportionately suffer from flooding. That's a huge problem in the Lower Price Hill neighborhood, which is right along the Ohio River and is in sort of that bowl shape of that sort of southern part of the city. But on the systems change component, one of the things that we're really excited about is having had pulled together coalitions of resident advisory groups that have come together to list their priorities and to be engaged really meaningfully in the development of the Green Cincinnati document. And I think there's a couple things that are really exciting about it. We've got residents' priorities and ideas included in the document that was codified this past April. So it's really exciting to see the words and the vision from people who live in communities that are dealing disproportionately with heat and with flooding and with poor air quality actually have a say and have their literal words put into the document. There's something that's really powerful. They are now the decision makers. And another piece that I'm so excited to talk about is that historically that plan has not been funded, which is so true across many municipalities. I think we've all had some engagement with like, gosh, there's some really good ideas there, and there's no money to do it. But something that has changed thanks to city councilors and advocacy from Groundwork ORV is actually getting portions of that plan to be funded. So there's dollars for that infrastructure and that infrastructure development. And that's something that's a huge deal in making changes to that built environment. And I would say that across the network that we've worked with, that tends to be where our systems changes used to be. One other example is in Central Falls in Pawtucket, Rhode Island, where trees used to be distributed by the municipality on a first come, first served basis. It was online, English only. Beginning of the season, you say, I want a tree, and you get one in your yard or in front of your home. That left out the huge Cape Verdean population. It left out the Dominican population. It left out folks without internet access. And one of the things that we were able to do is gather together with actually public health institutions to talk about this variance in heat, this variance in air quality as a public health issue, because we weren't having much success on sort of the, hey, this is a planning or urban forestry issue track, and pull together to view this as a public health issue. And we're able to get the cities of Central Falls and Pawtucket to instead use the tree equity score as a means of distribution instead of this first come, first serve model, and to secure $100,000 of public health funding to be able to plant trees in these communities to help expand the reach, which is something that I think is really exciting. So I would say, just to sort of sum that up, one other thing that I'll add is we find the use of maps and geospatial analysis to be tremendously useful in serving as a platform for conversations about equity. We work in the South, we work in the North, we work in the West, and we hear different variations of historical racism doesn't exist. Sometimes we'll hear that from our city officials, or, the climate crisis is not a real thing. It's just part of the natural cycle of the yada, yada, yada. And one of the things that I love about these maps is that when we're sitting across from a city councilor or a business owner or a resident, a couple of things happen. One is that the disparity between the areas is what grabs people's attention. We're doing a lot of door knocking in Richmond, Virginia, and we would first talk to residents in some of these neighborhoods that were disproportionately hot, they'd say, oh, it's Virginia, it's hot, it's always hot down here. But then we would show them that there's a 16-degree difference between the neighborhood that we were standing in at the same time on the same summer day as compared to a wealthier, whiter neighborhood. And that moves it from an us versus them problem to a crap, there's something that's wrong with our city. What are we going to do about it? And are we going to make a decision? And I think something that's so powerful about these geospatial tools is it forces us really into really uncomfortable questions. I think it's one really uncomfortable question. Why do things look the way that they do? And we have a choice to answer that question and to answer that honestly, or we have a choice to turn away from it. And something I've been excited about is through this process, a lot of people choose to engage with that question in a really meaningful way.
Thank you so much. We have quite a bit of questions in our Q&A that are directed towards some of the speakers. So I'm going to pass it over to Josh to get those kicked off.
Thanks, Jerka. Braden, I'm going to direct the first question towards you. So the participant here says, Braden touched on the topic of education in explaining how we arrived at this time in society, particularly redlining, urban renewal policies, and building household wealth. How do planners and professionals who work in this field get the ears of school boards and administrators to bring this discussion into the classrooms? We have grade school courses such as social studies, but it's often used as a forum for teaching histories, not usually about American housing policy and how those policies were racist in nature. I don't want to see a new generation inheriting the same shortfalls when it comes to understanding the many factors impacting American housing policy. So Braden, I'll let you kick that off. And if anyone else has thoughts, please feel free to share.
Yeah, I mean, I'll start by saying I definitely didn't learn about any of this in grade school or high school. Or, I mean, this is something that we don't really talk about. And, you know, there's a reason why. I mean, we know that this is a huge fight right now and it's being smeared. You know, the thing is that we've developed this actually with curriculum with Baltimore City Schools. We've done it in the Bronx. We've also had, you know, the exhibit's been a lot of spaces. Obviously, it's been in public libraries. It's been in a lot of places in Columbus. We've had a lot of students come through, and a lot of that education work has been done often as after school or field trips, you know, and stuff like that. Because, I mean, it's great, and the students can become so engaged. I mean, not only, and just to speak to this, not only in the history. We've had students who interview elders, who gather new history, who design projects, who want to address this. And I think that it's really important, you know, that when we do this, when we think of as designers, not just as historians, and it's really about getting folks engaged into what are we going to do about it, because that's where, you know, so much of the important energy is. And young people have such energy for that. But a lot of the times, yeah, so there's that's a huge opportunity. And I do think that coming to schools, coming to having field trips is great. Well, I know that I think it was in Ohio, I was working with an educator just about this in the classroom and how difficult it can be with the standards that they have to work within in terms of the topics. And where their wiggle room is. I mean, it's very tight. And so I think, you know, we know that school boards have been a huge site of contention. I think that many people on school boards do not know this history. So we can start with them. We can start with school administrators. I mean, we really have to be telling this history. If you bring restrictive deeds, if you bring redlining maps, if we bring, you know, one of the things is not just bringing those as artifacts of the past, but really understanding how does redlining lead to gentrification? Actually, you can't get to gentrification without redlining, because one, that helps, it's part of what creates hyper-segregation, which is needed for gentrification, and it artificially is going to devalue the real estate. When a real estate's artificially low, speculators are going to come in to want to flip that. So that becomes the impetus for why redline neighborhoods are actually some of the most real estate speculated neighborhoods in the country right now. And so, you know, as I said earlier, the history is an explanation for the present. And I really implore that when I talk to educators, you know, not to look at history as just an artifact of the past, which is, just to speak to my experience in high school, that was always the very dry way that history was presented, but actually to connect it to now. So I do think I think that, take on an advocacy role, show up at a school board meeting with maps, and say, how do we bring this into our classroom? Because one, there's a lot of kids in suburban areas or wherever that have no connection to this history. And then there's a lot of kids that really that live this every day, that that know it, but need that be armed with that history.
That's a great segue into the next question that we have here. I'm not exactly sure who to direct this to. Maybe I'll direct this to you, JT, and anyone else who might want to comment, please do. But the comment here is, I live in a middle income, ethnically diverse neighborhood in an affluent Columbus suburb. The school district is majority white, but my kid's neighborhood elementary is majority minority. I have noticed that many houses in my neighborhood that used to be occupied by homeowners are being bought up by large companies who are now renting the properties. How does this practice, which seems to be very prominent in affordable neighborhoods, connect with this history? JT, I wonder if you have a perspective on that from your position, and if you're noticing similar things in North Carolina.
Yeah, I think Braden touched a little bit about this in sort of his comment, but one of the fascinating things about where this questioner resides and all of these communities is how similar this process is across the country, right? It's just sort of like the exporting of this pernicious system. And what it is that we're seeing, right, is that you've got these communities that are almost cordoned off into sections, right? You've got really affluent blocks versus sort of less affluent blocks. And all of this was created as a function of these redlined areas, right? Where people were forced into sections of communities so that they could be sort of just piled on and removed from access to resources, right? And so what it is that we are seeing now is that the values in a particular area or spot will drop. You'll have developers or investors come in and kind of accentuate whatever it is that's going on there with regards to these values. And you start to see sort of with property values being affected, a lot of times those property values will be directly related to school expenditure is one of the things that we've seen in a lot of places. And sometimes that will sort of impact the quality of well, I don't want to say the quality, but the ability of a school to sort of fund educational resources, right? And so with regards to it, we are seeing it a lot in Durham. I think it happens across the country. And again, it's a matter of using education, getting this paperwork and this documentation together, getting the data together, and going to speak to elected officials, going to school board meetings, going to city council meetings, and sharing this, right? Because one of the amazing things that we've seen in Durham is that there are allies out there. There are people who want to help and to fight and to get involved in this, but a lot of times they don't know how. Right? They think that the issue is just unmanageable, or there are too many edges and nobody knows where to actually pick it up. And one of the things about helping empower people with education is that when people are educated, then they can speak truth to power, right? As the old saying goes. And when you're in these meetings and in these spaces, you can address misinformation that's being shared about, oh, well, this is just the way that it is, or we can't do anything about how this neighborhood is just kind of going. It's outside of our control and outside of our power. And I think one of the things, especially from a governmental perspective, is sometimes, local entities will say, well, our hands are tied. We can't really control how this works or what's going on here because it's, that's just kind of how capitalism works. And to some extent, there's some truth to that. But as we've seen with the entities and organizations that are represented on this panel, people can make a difference when they pull together and they go out and they fight, right? Elected officials have to do what their constituents make them do, or they won't get reelected. And that's why so many people should really think about not just going to city council meetings by themselves, but to join or create organizations where you can pull your power with individuals, so that issues like the one that the questioner just sort of mentioned are not allowed to just sort of perpetuate themselves. They're confronted head on. That would kind of be my thoughts on that. Hopefully I answered the question.
I'd love to jump in on that one too. I think that, and you got to a lot of these points, I think that we need to recognize that policies are vessels for current or aspirational values, and that local governments, when it comes to housing, when it comes to the siting of transportation, it's real people making real decisions to either affirmatively act on something or to choose to ignore it. And I think one of the ways that this connects to historical race-based housing segregation, to these restrictive covenants, is that we have decided as a culture, for better or for worse, I think it's for worse, is that we've decided that housing is like the mechanism for building wealth for individuals, for corporations, for systems, instead of just being a human necessity. And everything else just is like super far out and super not conceivable. But things don't have to look the way that they do. Like, we do have a choice to put restrictions on the ways in which we view housing as a commodity. There's lots of really great organizations that are working on different types of decommodified housing. That's everything from renters, co-ops, where folks come together and buy and manage and build the building themselves, to community land trusts, to really thoughtful disposition of properties from community land banks to keep them out of the hands of speculative investors. I think that one of the things to note is that we actually don't have to accept that, like, this is the form of capitalism. You can be a pro-capitalist person, you can be super on board with the way that 99% of things work, but it's okay to be pissed off about this like 1% of things, and to push back against the idea that people should be able to get limitless returns. What can you do? You can push for rent stabilization, especially for property owners that own more than, say, 2 or 3 properties. So you can get out of what about the mom and pop landlords argument, and start pushing back against these larger developers. So I say that to say that this is a continuation of a decision, of a value that we have decided to either affirmatively further or to stay quiet on. The idea that housing is the mechanism for intergenerational wealth building, and we've decided to just accept that. You don't have to, like, we don't have to. We can pull folks together and can say, like, actually the landed class is out of control, and we need to push back against the system of buying up these properties speculatively. And that's for showing up in your local elections, which, like, no one really does, which I get. Like, the polling times are weird, and like, what is a comptroller anyway? But like, showing up and making those decisions is really important, because that's actually where the fulcrum point is to leverage the most change at the local level, is with those elected officials. They kind of have to listen to you, or you can throw them out of office.
Thank you both. We have some really interesting questions here related to land use planning, and I'm going to try to combine a couple of them under the theme of sort of how do you communicate with stakeholders or work with stakeholders to try to address where policies or values might come into conflict. And a couple of the examples in the questions are, so for example, sometimes housing developers might ask to reduce green space in order to create affordable housing. So how might you sort of advocate for potentially the keeping of the green space for future residents? Another example is wanting to plant trees, street trees, but in the adjacent neighborhood, the residents don't necessarily want to deal with the costs or the maintenance or any hazard concerns related to the street trees. And so there's a little bit of a conflict there between what the most appropriate decision might be. So I'll stop talking and leave it to whoever amongst you wants to try to address how you might work with stakeholders in that situation.
I'll just add a quick one, Josh, that I think that as far as the question for developers or development, I feel that it goes, I can't remember who said it on the panel. Sometimes they just don't know in order to do better. And I think this is where the prime opportunity becomes accentuated to begin supporting the developers that are not willing to make that compromise. And that is a tactic that you can use for planning, along with changing zoning laws, along with sort of implementing policy, is beginning to lift up in the marketplace the developers that see the value of the green spaces and the housing units, that are not just looking to maximize profitability. There are a few examples in the Bronx that are from the turn of the 20th century, back to Cate's point, that are limited equity co-ops. One is amalgamated housing that had this healthy infusion of green space as well as units, and they're in perpetuity affordable because they're taken off of the speculative market. Instead of a renter, you own shares into a co-op the co-op itself has a right of first refusal. So again, the developer concept or mentality of how we spatialize equity, there are brilliant models that go as far back as, again, the turn of the century. It's how do we then bring them, resuscitate them, and begin to challenge sort of who's doing the development in our spaces today. So I think that that's one tactic, because as we see with the US Supreme Court, laws can just change about who's implemented into positions of power. So I think that there has to be a multi-pronged approach if we're ever going to really address and heal. And again, because the psychology is so deep around segregation and development and commodification of housing, that we have to begin showing the third rail or the third space. So as a tactic to do this, it's how do we find and hold accountability or hold accountable the RFPs that cities are issuing for the development of spaces and or the local funding or the government is funding. That's a tactic that I think we can begin to employ to really address planning and zoning.
You know, if I could just jump in on that, I think, you know, when I'll just take the other piece of the street trees. You know, I've talked to many people who are wary of things like street trees or bike lanes or, you know, all kinds of, you know, public investments into space, which tend, you know, we actually know private investment tends to chase public investments. And so, you know, part of, you know, a neighborhood, there's some great models out there for policy around quote unquote neighborhoods in transition, or neighborhoods that really are targets for speculation, particularly around predatory practices. I mean, one of the things that when we talk about, for example, the corporate folks coming in to buy places up, is really to see this as predatory. I mean, this is, you know, there are folks, for example, we were talking to folks in Lexington about, you know, here are places in a red line neighborhood, right? These are homeowners, but when you don't have access to finance, it's really hard to gut reno your house, right? Every 20 years, and hard to fix up the roof and get the financing to do that. And so guess what? Now there's code violations, right? So now you have predatory actors coming in and getting, you know, calling in code violations on houses and saying, hey, you can't pay off that code violation. I'll just buy the house from you, and I can do the renoing. And so you have using the systems that are in place actually by the city, by planning, et cetera, to, you know, extrapolate wealth and get houses out of folks' hands. So how do the planners come in? How do the city come in? How do others come in to say, okay, actually what we need is a grants program, because people have been systematically cut out of wealth and the ability to you know, fix up homes, et cetera. And so we're going to help them do that rather than a punitive approach of having, you know, code violations and what have you. And so you have to really, and there's an education piece. There's all these pieces of coming to folks. And actually, we were very proud that the exhibit was in Evanston, Illinois. It was used as a tool by Robin Rue Simmons, who's an alderman there, for the first municipal reparations policy in the US. And that was actually grants to existing homeowners, as well as down payment assistance grants for new homeowners to build wealth with folks who got cut out of it because of redlining. And the last thing I'll just really quickly say, I know it's long, but I noticed the quote about gated communities. The other half of this, of course, is green-lined neighborhoods. That's the other side of the coin, right? Is actually exclusive areas that we said, okay, these are homogeneous areas. These are areas that maintain their value through exclusivity. And by the time you get to the 68 Fair Housing Act, you say you can't do it based on race explicitly, you get an explosion of restrictive zoning, single family home zoning. You get all these measures to try and preserve, you know, essentially neighborhoods as they are. It's created we need more housing. There's not enough housing, but also there's a lot of speculation on housing. You know, so there's a lot of pieces there. And I think that if you look at green line areas as just as much a problem neighborhoods as are quote unquote red line neighborhoods, right? So that, I think, you know, when you look at rezoning and removing these exclusionary policies, has to come down totally. And I know that that's going on in Columbus with the rezoning work being done now. So
Thank you all so much. This was a great discussion, and thank you for the work that you're doing that we got to learn about today. I'm sorry to the folks whose questions we didn't get to, but thank you again for everything that you've shared today. And I look forward to hearing more about your work as it continues. I'm going to let Jerica close us out.
Thank you guys for joining us today. Join us again on August 8th for our new Just Streets segment that'll have Dr. Destiny de Guzman. So on September 8th at noon, register for that event as well. And we will see you next time. Bye.
Thank you, everyone. Take care. Bye-bye.